became a career firefighter with the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Service, the chief of the medical division, or EMS, the unofficial historian of the Howard County Department of Fire and Rescue Services. Over 65,000 digital images and newspaper articles, magazine articles, etc. Episode 25-34, Don Gow, the man, the legend, Baltimore City Fire Department, and the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. I first got to know Don Gow through his connection with the Baltimore City Fire Department and specifically their Critical Incident Stress Management Program. He was a leader and promoter of that particular program to help emergency services personnel who had been through tragic events, to help them deal with the tragedy and to also be able to come back and go back to work and continue the great job that they were doing. He worked with the Baltimore City Fire Department from roughly 1970 until 1999 when he retired. He came on to ICSF roughly 2000 and continued with ICSF until 2015, 2016 or so. Don and I had many conversations about his time in the fire service and also about his time in the military. Don was a proud member of the United States Marine Corps in the late 60s. Again, he and I talked about that somewhat briefly, and I'd made the mistake one time of asking him, when you served, where did you serve? He did say in Southeast Asia, the Vietnam area, which was during the Vietnam War of the late 60s and early 70s. And I made the mistake of asking him, when you were there, what were your assignments? What did you do? And with a gleam in his eye, he said, I'll tell you, but I'm going to have to kill you afterwards. I never asked him that question again. I love sitting down and talking with Don about his exploit within the Baltimore City Fire Department, of which there were many, many, many. A couple of the gems that he would tell me was back in 1971 or so. He was almost a witness to one of the first mass shootings within the nation at his fire station on Frederick Road on Caton Avenue in Baltimore City, 1 or 2 blocks down from the station. There was a business called the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company. An individual employee went on a shooting rampage, ended up killing 5 people and injuring many others. Don was working the station that day, standing on the front of the station, and when he saw sort of a mob running up from Pittsburgh Plate Glass, coming up Frederick Road towards the fire station, and as the folks got closer, they were yelling, he's got a gun, he's shooting people, etc. When they reached the station, Don herded them into the fire station, and then shortly afterwards, he could see the gunman walking up the center of Frederick Road, potentially firing random shots. Don retreated with the rest of the folks into the fire station, closed the doors, and tried to lock the front door. While he was in the fire station, the gentleman fired a couple more rounds, and then Don could tell that he had stopped to reload. Don, being an ex-Marine and showing limited fear, grabbed a lead pipe and went running outside. As soon as he got outside the front door, what he saw and heard, he saw the bad guy, and he heard a click with the guy loading a magazine into his rifle, which Don figured today was not going to be his day to be a hero. He spun around to run around the backside of the fire station, and as he did, the bad guy fired off a couple rounds in his direction, hitting the brick wall of the station with pieces of brick hitting him as he went around the corner. He went to the rear of the fire station as individuals were trying to get out of the rear of the fire station. He herded them back into the fire station. As all this was going on and everything was happening very rapidly, as he was herding people back into the fire station, out front, the bad guy who was standing out front on the apron, a Baltimore City police officer, pulls up onto the apron, not knowing anything had happened. As he gets out of his police vehicle, the bad guy shoots him in the leg, causing a severe arterial hemorrhage. The officer collapses next to his vehicle. Also, just as that happened, other Baltimore City police officers pulled up the scene and shot the bad guy who fell. And then just as all that was happening, the ambulance from the station was returning from St. Agnes Hospital and was going to pull up and back into the station. But they couldn't because some clown was laying in front of the fire station. They thought it was one of the local drunks, and they got out, started yelling and screaming at him to get up and move out of the way, and it turned out to be either the police officer or the bad guy. But that was Don's encounter with the mass shooting. Actually, the bad guy, in firing off some of the rounds, actually shot the antenna off of his pickup truck. So that was one encounter. A couple other interesting things that happened to him. Responding to a shooting when he rode the ambulance, and he rode the ambulance with a degree of frequency. Pulled up to the scene of a shooting. He got there before the police, and he got there before the shooting was actually over with. As the ambulance pulled up to the scene, The bad guy walks over to the ambulance and in Baltimore City vernacular just tells him, drive around the block one time. Don didn't question that, drive around the block and came back. By that time, the bad guy had finished his work and moved on. But that was sort of not uncommon. Another time, they had loaded a patient into the back of the ambulance, resulting from a shooting. Police were not there, at least at that moment in time, to secure the scene nor the ambulance. Don was working in the back of the ambulance, straddling the patient at the foot of the cot. Suddenly the door opens up and a bad guy says, don't move anybody, of which Don complied, and the bad guy shot between his legs and finished off the guy on the stretcher. So again, that was another Don Gow event within the fire service. Don Gow had many trips to the hospital. Dozens of times he went to the hospital for treatment, hospital stays. He had so many that I asked him one time, Don, do you mind documenting times you went to the hospital, what hospital, why you went there, and the amount of time that you spent in the hospital? And holy mackerel, he rattled off, I think, 3 or 4 pages of which you can observe here on the podcast. Some of his more remarkable situations. One time he had to go to shock trauma for a building fire where he walked into a fuse box and was electrocuted. He was in shock trauma for 24 hours and 3 days off work. Another time there was an explosion and his head and shoulder received burns, and again went to the trauma center for 7 hours and was off duty for a couple days. Another time he was in an ambulance and the ambulance was hit by a police car, had gone to Mercy Hospital, was off duty for 8 days. Another time there was an explosion in a warehouse where he received a severe concussion, went to shock trauma and was off duty for 9 weeks. Another time he was caught in a backdraft where the backdraft occurred and both he and his partner were blown out of the apartment into the stairwell and actually down a stairwell. Ended up going to St. Agnes Hospital, was in the hospital for 5.5 days and was on light duty for 3.5 months. With that same incident where he was caught in a backdraft, he was an acting lieutenant on that particular call, and on that particular backdraft he had head, back, hearing loss, small bones broken in his ear, fractured skull from being rolled out of the apartment and down the steps. He was in serious condition when the roof collapsed on top of him, and I said he went to St. Agnes Hospital. He was in such severe condition that his fellow firefighter, his pipe man, refused to leave him in the hospital, and he stayed with him in the hospital until the firefighter was assured that he was going to make it through and survive. 3 days later, the firefighter quit the department and moved to North Carolina and became a preacher. Another time he was caught in another flashover. He had taken out a window at the bar level and backdraft occurred down the hall and thrown down a flight of steps from the second floor. All the hair was burnt off below his helmet and off his face, and he spent a couple days at Mercy Hospital. Another time Don was fighting a fire and heavy smoke and fire were present, and all of a sudden the roof and ceiling came down on him. And as he said, I don't remember much after that. I was told that I was non-responsive, not breathing on my own, and his personnel responded quickly, did chest compressions, gave him O2, and was taken to St. Agnes Hospital for further stabilization and treatment. He spent 13 days off for that particular episode. Another time, he was at the scene of a house fire. He had been riding the back step, and the assignment of the person riding the back step was to get off the fire engine, take the hose off, and attach it to the fire hydrant, and then the fire engine was going down the street. On this particular day, as he got off the fire truck and they started to hook up the fire hose to the hydrant, a trash truck came along, ran over the fire hose, wrapped the fire hose around the axle of the trash truck. Just as Don was getting ready to hook up the hose and appliance to the hydrant, ended up dragging him down the street. He's actually riding backwards down the street on the hose and on the appliance down the street. The trash truck makes a sharp right-hand turn at the intersection, and just as that happens, the hook and ladder truck is coming from the opposite direction and swings wide. It almost runs over him, but didn't hit him, and he is off for a day for that. Another time he had responded to the scene of a structure fire. It was on the back step, was told to lead off, in other words, to take the hose off the back of the engine and hook it up to the fire hydrant. When he did that, unbeknownst to him, him, where the engine actually stopped was adjacent to an open manhole cover. And as he stepped off, not thinking that there'd be a problem, but as he stepped off, he fell into the open manhole cover and down into the sewer. Again, to shock trauma, he went and was out of service for up to 14 days. And finally, in 1996 until November 98, he had responded to a couple of medical incidents to assist the ambulance, where he noted that he was being short of breath and some chest pains. And the bottom line is that found out they'd had a 98% blockage in one of his cardiac arteries, that they did a bypass, and he did very well after that, but he retired in June 30th of 1999. So those are just some of the unique situations that Don faced in his tenure within the fire service. Now, because of that, listing all those injuries that he had as part of being in the Baltimore City Fire Department, there was an astounding number of incidents. One thing that I found humorous, Don Gall humorous, and Jeannie Gall, his wife, humorous, when his wife would be notified that Don was in a hospital somewhere, and they called to let her know that, Don has been injured and is in a hospital, she simply asked, "Just tell me what hospital he's in this time." That's all she wanted to know, so she could find him. Because of all the injuries that he had in his career, I decided I was going to do something as far as when I was teaching EMT classes and even some fire classes, that I would give the students in the class what I like to call an injury quiz, where I would list a whole bunch of injuries from anywhere from abrasions, assault, burn, cardiovascular incidents, dislocations, electrical shock, eye injury. I mean, it went down the entire list of all the injuries I could think of that a firefighter might have. I listed all those injuries, and then at the very bottom I listed potentially how the firefighter might have received treatment, and basically asking, were you seen in the emergency room? Were you transported to the emergency room by an ambulance? Were you transported to the hospital by helicopter? Were you admitted to the helicopter? Were you admitted to the hospital, etc.? And what I did, I listed that, and then I asked my students, either brand new EMTs who really had no idea what they're getting into, I asked them to just think that you are going to be in the fire service for 3 to 5 years, and if that's the case, circle the injuries that you think you may have being in the fire service. You're in the fire service, you're moderately active, just circle the number of injuries you think that you may have. I also gave the same injury quiz to veteran firefighters, anywhere from 5 to 30 years on the job, and I asked them the same question. Take a moment, circle those injuries that are listed that you had, not that you saw, that occurred to you. And the results were very surprising. For the students, they put down, I'm going to have 10 of these injuries or 15 of these injuries. When the career firefighters, both volunteer and career, took the quiz, and if they took it honestly, they would come back with anywhere from 25 to 30 of those injuries that they received on the job. I myself received 27 of those injuries that you see listed. And I was thinking that, my goodness gracious, had I taken this quiz just before I got in the fire service and someone said, "Don, you're going to have 27 of these injuries that you see listed," I'm not sure I would have gotten in the fire service, because I don't want to have any of those injuries, let alone picking 27 of those injuries that eventually I was going to have. Another strange thing, that when the veteran firefighters, both volunteer and career, started to circle the list of the injuries that they had, or even more importantly, did not circle something such as smoke inhalation. Many firefighters never circled smoke inhalation. And I asked why. Well, I didn't go to the hospital, to the hyperbaric chamber. I was just hacking and coughing and whatever. That was smoke inhalation, dude. Well, I never got stitches for the bad laceration, but I just put a Steri-Strip on it. Dude, that's a laceration that you had. And come to find out that we in public safety, and this applied both to police and fire, many of the injuries, actual injuries that we had, we considered them as inconsequential. But the reality is, compared to most other professions, computer programmer, clerk, school teacher, whatever, most of those folks might list 3 or 4 of the injuries on that sheet. We in public safety sometimes just take it for granted and really don't think of ourselves as being injured. It's just a scratch. Yeah, I dislocated my finger, but I popped it back into place, a sort of thing. And it's just unique, the mindset that we in public safety have about the injuries that we get on the job. After a storied career with the fire service and many years working with the International Critical Illness Stress Foundation, he worked worked as our logistics manager for ICSF, and his wife actually worked as their information specialist. And they put in many years of dedicated service to the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. One of the other humorous things that Don did, he would send out both messages, emails and messages, both internally and externally from the organization to folk. And Don would admit it, if he's alive today, that he was not a master of the English language. And many times as he wrote his messages, I'll just say that they were loaded with Don Gow-isms that made me smile when I read those. I just wish I'd kept some of those to look at it again today. But when he wrote these messages, he was sincere about writing them, but when you read them, it brought a smile to my face as to what he was doing. September 18th, 2015, after many false starts on Don's behalf, he did pass away from complications of cardiac issues, etc. And he is and was sorely missed. One of the things that I was proud of after he passed, that I was able to give his wife and daughter a copy of the injuries that he had received while on the job. And I encouraged them to seek out an attorney that I had used for injuries related in the fire service, to ask them to look at the presumptive disability law, which was basically a law that said if you're an emergency services person, firefighter, and if you have these medical problems, it is presumed that you got them while on the job, and if that's the case, you will be compensated. Even though he had passed, they took the document to a particular attorney that I used. He looked at it and said, this is a slam dunk. And in very short order, the family was able to receive the maximum benefit due for the presumptive disability law. All I can say is that Don was a very dedicated individual, very professional when it came to ICSF, a very honest individual, and always had the best interest of those that were impacted by these negative events that we in public safety see. I said he's very compassionate, spent many hours on the phone talking one-on-one with folks. He also was part of the CSM teams that went out and helped fire service people get through their tough time. He was just a positive example of what it was to be a dedicated emergency service person, and a positive example of individual that cared about his fellow firefighter. And probably the best thing that I can say about my time and exposure to Don Gow is that the best thing that he gave me was allowing me to call him friend. Please use your remaining heartbeats wisely and not waste a single precious one.